So a very big welcome from Greater Manchester Combined Authority and our team to today's webinar on biodiversity net gain. My name is Sam Evans. I work as Head of Natural Environment at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, and it's great to have so many of you signed up and here today. Obviously, it's unfortunate that we can't be together in a room, but it's lovely to have so many of you joining virtually today. It's a really exciting time for our work on the natural environment in Greater Manchester. There's exciting developments happening nationally with the government's Environment Bill and all the measures that will bring to help us enhance our natural environment. And there's lots that we are doing locally as well, which we'll talk to you about today. Just a bit of housekeeping. You'll all be in participant mode on mute on Zoom. We do have a chat function and a Q&A function as well. So please do make use of those. We will have time for questions at the end. So please, as we're going along, drop any questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of Zoom. And any issues, please raise those in the chat. So could we go to the next slide, please? So just to introduce those of us speaking today, as I said, I'm Sam Evans, Head of Natural Environment at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, and we've got a great lineup of other speakers joining us today. So we've got Nick White, who's Principal Advisor for Net Gain at Natural England. We've got Derek Richardson, who's the Principal Ecologist at our Greater Manchester Ecology Unit. We've got Julia Baker, who's Biodiversity Technical Specialist at Balfour Beatty, and Tom Butterworth, who's Technical Director at WSP. So a really great panel of people to talk you through what we're doing on biodiversity net gain within Greater Manchester and the context of that in national government. So we hope it's a great hour and a half or so. We've got some great speakers, and there'll be some time to hear and answer some of your questions at the end. So I'll leave the introductions there, and I'll hand over to Julia and Tom to start to take us through today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. And yes, welcome everybody. Lovely to be here, and thank you so much for the opportunity. The only other piece of housekeeping I think is worth mentioning, we are recording this webinar, so please be aware of that. We'll be able to make that available to you all later as well. But just so that you're aware that it's recorded. As Sam has said, my name's Tom Butterworth. I'm Technical Director in WSP, overseeing our work on biodiversity net gain. And I'm joined, I'm very glad to say, by Julia Baker. Julia, would you like to say hello and introduce yourself?
Yes, hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I'm Julia. I head up biodiversity net gain for Balfour Beatty. We're one of the largest contractors in the UK.
So we're going to run through some very specific elements about biodiversity net gain today, relating to how biodiversity net gain will play out in Greater Manchester. We're going to start with some context, just making sure that we're all on the same page about what biodiversity net gain is. Then we're going to be joined by Nick White, and Nick from Natural England is going to give us an overview of where we are nationally with policy and legislation. So great to have you here, Nick. Then we'll move on to talking about development process, and this is where we start to get into the detail about what's happening in Greater Manchester and the planning requirements there. And we'll also talk about how biodiversity net gain plays out in different stages within a development project. So that we'll have a bit of an opportunity to look at how biodiversity net gain might shape and change how we work on development. Then we're going to talk about the nature recovery plans and green infrastructure plans within Greater Manchester, because the contributions to that biodiversity net gain can make to those are really important. And then we're going to, as a sort of last but not least element, talk about the role of the local authorities within this, and specifically the Greater Manchester Ecology Unit. And we've got Derek, as you've heard, who's going to speak to that. So that's what our plan is for this afternoon. I hope that's what you were expecting. We're going to dive straight into what biodiversity net gain is. Julia.
Yeah, what is it? What really is biodiversity net gain? And I'd like to make this point pretty clearly, because Net gain is not business as usual, and using a biodiversity metric to get to an increase in percentage. And a lot of people are talking about this 10% that's coming from the Environment Bill. It's not that. It's not simply business as usual and then totting up the numbers to get to 10% increase. This definition, I love it because it shows us truly the path ahead that we are on. It is about development that leaves the natural environment in a measurably better state than before. So if we just take a step back and really think what that means is because that development has happened, and that might be a housing development or a road or a railway or mixed use or whatever that development might be, because that's happened, the natural environment's better off. And that's so much more than just the metric. And I love the metric and we'll certainly talk about it, but it's a fundamentally different way of thinking, planning, budgeting our development. Now, we are on a transition to truly get there. And that's going to take all of us around the room, whether it be industry and governments and NGOs and communities and landowners. But that's truly the path ahead towards us. And what we've got to do is look at everything in our toolkit to help us get to that final place.
Very good. Thank you, Julia. So one way of expressing this would be to look at perhaps business as usual as being delivering net loss or even no net loss if we're lucky. And that's where we get a development coming in and we might replace some of the habitats. We might look to support some of the ecosystems through our work. But if we end up with an overall loss, that's a net loss. If we've got the same as before, by the time those habitats are fully mature, that would be no net loss. But what we're looking for is a net gain, and that includes an increase in the biodiversity resulting from that development. And the people here are purposeful as well. And we'll come back to this point when we start to talk about the importance of the links with green infrastructure and optimizing the wider benefits we can get from biodiversity net gain. Now, that's a overview of biodiversity net gain. We're going to come back in a moment to talk about the principles that underpin this. But before we do, I want to pass to Nick White to talk about how this plays out in, or how this is playing out in policy, and how we're likely to see this play out in legislation going forward. Nick, can I pass to you to introduce yourself and just shout next slide when you're ready.
Thank you, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, just going to, as Tom described, just set out where we are with net gain policy now. I'm going to, in a second, talk a little bit about the Environment Bill and what's coming down the line with mandatory net gain. But before I do, I just wanted to remind us that actually there's a lot of policy already about net gain, and a lot of planning authorities are already beginning to successfully implement net gain. I know that's net gain is being delivered in Greater Manchester, for example, as well. And that's in part because the National Planning Policy Framework was significantly updated in 2019 to kind of strengthen the wording around net gain in it. So it now talks about net gains being measurable. It references the use of a biodiversity metric. Further details about net gain were set out in the accompanying update to the planning practice guidance as well. So it very much is government's kind of ambition and policy for local planning authorities in particular to be looking to sort of update their own local plans in line with NPPF and to be encouraging the bringing forward of net gain through the local plan making process. And so we're delighted that that's happening. Alongside that, there's also been updates to national design guides and idea of national design codes as well, which make reference to net gain, and work is underway on some of the national policy statements, so particularly the draft water resources and the nuclear one, again with a view of bringing net gain into almost as business as usual into some infrastructure projects as well. So there is a lot already happening, but next slide please, Tom. So, but this is now moving on to the Environment Bill and thinking about what does that say about this idea of introducing a mandatory requirement for biodiversity net gain. And obviously it's getting a lot of attention. So a few things firstly to bear in mind about the bill. Firstly, this bit of the bill applies to England only. So the net gain bit only applies to England. And what it does, it has the effect of amending the Town and Country Planning Act. So it introduces a minimum 10% biodiversity net gain requirement for all developments going through the TCPA consenting route. And for that, those ought to be calculating using the same standardized metric, the biodiversity metric 3 as it will be, and also submitting a net gain plan to the planning authority. The bill requires that all habitats are secured for at least 30 years, and that's true whether it's being delivered off-site as well as with on. There's also a lot of further detail about this bill still to come. So although the bill is currently in Parliament and it's anticipated to get royal assent sometime this autumn, there's an awful lot of detail still to be set out in secondary legislation. There's likely to be a consultation on that in the autumn period, but do keep an eye on that because there's a lot more information to come, such as the detail of what's in the net gain plan, for example. As I mentioned, the bill is looking for royal assent in the autumn. It's not likely to introduce a legal requirement until 2023, autumn 2023 at the earliest, because there's a 2-year transition period between royal assent and the implementation of net gain. And that's to allow various things to be set up that needs to be established before it can operate as a system, such as a national net gain register, which will be established. Also, just to highlight that the bill doesn't change any existing legal protections, doesn't change anything to do with protected irreplaceable habitats or protected sites. It also doesn't apply to nationally significant infrastructure projects or to marine projects either. I'll come back to those very briefly. Next slide, please, Tom. So there's 3 broad approaches for being able to deliver net gain that the bill sets out. Firstly, it encourages people to consider opportunities for delivering on-site, so within a red line of a project. And that could be through enhancing the existing green infrastructure or putting new green infrastructure into the site, delivered through enhanced landscaping. Secondly, it's looking to create a market in the delivery of net gain units. So local landowners, be it local planning authorities, NGOs, farmers, anyone with appropriate land, providing units that the developer can then buy and deliver net gain off their site. And you could do those 2 in combination. You could do on and off site. And then finally, if it's not possible to deliver net gain on site, if there's no local land available to deliver and contract with, you can buy statutory credits from government, and the intention is to invest those in landscape scale strategic outcomes. Next slide, please, Tom. Outside of the bill, there are also other things underway as well. So I mentioned the bill doesn't talk about marine net gain or nationally significant infrastructure projects. Work is progressing outside of the bill on that. So working with marine industries and DEFRA, MMO and the like, work is starting now on what marine net gain may look like. Equally, there is a lot of NSIPs, nationally significant infrastructure projects, already taking forward net gain. We're consulting and talking to government as to how we can further encourage that. And it was really welcome to see the report just on Friday from the National Infrastructure Commission talking about the need for net gains from infrastructure. Government's ambition, though, has always been to go beyond biodiversity and achieve environmental net gain, and that's still very much the kind of longer term direction of travel. There will be some kind of voluntary metric coming out in the late spring that people can use to measure that. And then the other thing, just finally to mention, is the planning white paper. Obviously, there's a lot of change potentially coming down the line in terms of the planning system. Net gain interacts with that system. And so it's just to be aware that there could be some further tweaks in order to make sure the mandatory approach is able to work with revisions to the planning system. And at that point, I shall hand you back to Tom and Julia.
Thank you so much, Nick. We've had a few questions in relation to this, but I think what we'll do is we'll hold some of those questions until the end. The one thing I just wanted to ask at this point, or to clarify at this point, one of the questions was how is a nationally significant infrastructure project defined in relation to this? I don't know whether you're able to speak to that, Nick.
They go through different consenting routes. So they're outside of the Town and Country Planning Act. So they have their own consenting regimes. So they will be dealt with separately.
And they're defined, certainly for road schemes I've been working on, around size and scale of the project and so on. So it's the larger projects but also energy infrastructure projects and so on sit within that category, generally speaking. But yeah, thank you. Very good. Okay, that's a really helpful overview. Thank you, Nick. And it's really clear that we've got some significant changes coming through because of the Environment Bill. What we wanted to then move on to is talk about how biodiversity net gain is defined beyond that high level ambition that Julia set out earlier, but actually to talk about the underpinning principles that drive forward what biodiversity net gain is and how we deliver it. So Julia, would you like to open up with talking about these 10 good practice principles?
Yes, absolutely. And this was back in that 2016, we realized, and this is very much on an industry basis, you know, we realized that there was a lot of voluntary commitments, and brilliantly voluntary commitments being made to biodiversity net gain. But what does good look like? And this is what we do in industry. We ask, what does good look like? And that might be set out in standards, or in this case, principles. So it's no different from any other element, but we set these out. And there's a few things about these principles to bring out to them. There's 10, but they come together as one. You can't pick and choose, and they are high level guiding principles to then apply in a very, very site specific way. But it is to apply them as best as possible, given the fact that we're quite early on in our journey towards net gain. But this is ultimately what good looks like, and certainly within our work, we've been using these as a benchmark to guide our way with net gain. And I guess the first one starts with applying the mitigation hierarchy, and I think we've got a slide coming up about that, which is very much part of the process. So the process to achieve net gain starts off, which is fundamentally now a part of the planning system, is to first avoid biodiversity loss and then minimize the loss. It's not about jumping to the end when we get to the net bit. So net means that we've lost biodiversity in one place and we're picking it up somewhere else. It's avoiding and then minimizing the loss. And just to highlight this in a very, very practical way, you know, I tend to work in around the transport networks, or even with housing developments, when our footprint is incredibly tight and our construction teams always need space, but there is always something that we can do. So it's to look at this as a process to achieve net gain. And when you follow this process, you create structure, you create consistency, and when you get that, you get better outcomes.
So we've got a really important fundamental principle here of applying the mitigation hierarchy. But as you can see, we've got a whole set of other principles here that are also really important in actually shaping how we define and deliver biodiversity net gain. For example, avoiding losses that cannot be offset elsewhere. Nick has already mentioned that those irreplaceable habitats are outside of our requirement for biodiversity net gain because there's existing policy legislation supporting them. And so we need to make sure that we're delivering gains for all of those other habitats and avoiding impacts on those irreplaceable habitats wherever possible. One of the others I'm going to draw out specifically here is make a measurable net gain contribution. And I want to draw that specifically because very often, and Julia said this right at the beginning, very often we think of net gain as a process where we come up with a load of numbers for defining how much gain or loss we've got in terms of biodiversity, and we get an overall figure. We've delivered the 10%, job done, good. We get our planning permission agreed. A really important point here is this: making a measurable net gain contribution is only one principle out of these 10. And the making measurable piece is actually half of that fifth principle. What we're making a contribution toward is also really crucial. And later on in our presentation today, we're going to talk about some of the things that we might be contributing towards within Greater Manchester, whether that be the green infrastructure strategies, nature recovery strategy, and so on. But the measurable piece, let's just have a look at that. And this is, as Nick alluded to, we've got a standardized metric for assessing change in biodiversity. It is one piece of this puzzle, but it is an important piece. And it sets out a standard approach where you take the area or length of a habitat, then some measures around its quality, its distinctiveness, the habitat type, its condition, also where it is in relation to a wider ecological network. And those are given standard scores that we multiply together to get a biodiversity unit score. And that's compared before and after, before the development and after the development. After the development, you may be able to see on this slide, I'll see if I can highlight with a highlighter pen in here, we've got some other factors, some risk factors, how difficult the habitat is to create, how long it takes to create. And these mean that if the habitat is more difficult to create, if it takes longer, then we need to create either more habitat in area or a better quality habitat to compensate for the loss. And this is going to be standardized under a biodiversity metric. We've got a 2.0 out on the Natural England website at the moment, and we will soon, I hope, have 3.0 that will be a standard metric for everybody to use. But this is one part of those 10 good practice principles, and only one part. It's a proxy. It's never going to capture all of biodiversity. It's a proxy and for the biodiversity value, and should be used to indicate where we're heading and make sure that we can deliver that 10%, but in the context of making sure that we're supporting the species, the biodiversity that we're finding on that site. Julia, do you want to say anything more about this? Yeah.
Yeah, no, you and I mean, it's the metric has transformed my work. It really has, you know, being able to quantify the outcomes. You know, I've long worked with sustainability colleagues in carbon and waste, and they've always can produce fancy graphs and everything, but it's not just about the numbers. It has to be ecologically driven, you know, from a very, very strong ecological perspective. So there has to be ecology justification behind what the numbers are showing you. But the one thing that I want to say about this is, what's the data? The data is about habitats. So what does that mean? And I always get asked this when I go to my construction site. Okay, Julie, have you seen the graph? That's great. We're a contractor. What do we physically do on site? What are we going to build? We're going to be building habitats. This is all about habitats. And I love that. You know, it's the ultimate build it and they will come type approach for wildlife. But when we think about net gain, it's really taking us back to that grassroots. This is about habitats, and that's where we need to be.
And this, I'm going to answer one of the questions that's been put in about bird boxes or swift bricks. It's really important to recognize that, as Julia says, this metric is about the habitats. It doesn't include the swift bricks or bird boxes or bat boxes. But your net gain assessment absolutely should as a whole, because we should be aiming to use this metric to, yes, build those habitats and the species will come, but that should be part of a wider strategy that's incorporating the needs for the protected species, your bird boxes and bat boxes, and so on, so that this becomes an integrated approach that allows you to deliver for biodiversity. So just because they're not in the metric doesn't mean you shouldn't be talking about them in your biodiversity assessment and including them in your plans for the site. Now, however, having said this, biodiversity net gain doesn't cover everything, and we've already alluded to some of that already. It doesn't cover the irreplaceable habitats, and those irreplaceable habitats would include ancient woodland, limestone pavement, but we can't deliver a net gain on something that can't be replaced. And so it's really important that that's taken into account, that they're moved separately from this assessment, and that the assessment on what to do about avoiding those, ideally, avoiding those really important habitats. But if we can't avoid them, putting back appropriate delivery of additional habitat to compensate in some way, that needs to be done separately from the biodiversity net gain assessment. This is also supported by the fact that we've got existing policy and legislation to support those habitats, and we don't need to complicate matters by having overlapping policy. The other piece here is that, as we've said already, and just this is really to underline this point, this is not just about the numbers. This is really, really important, and this speaks to the point I was just making about the swift bricks, for example. And it's really, really crucial that we deliver meaningful ecological outcomes with this work. This is not a way of sidestepping that mitigation hierarchy, but about reinforcing it. And actually, if you start using the metric and start using the approach here, you'll find that the metric itself actually reinforces that mitigation hierarchy. It's
and just to come in there
yeah.
about you know, about biodiversity net gain being, and it's got to be underpinned, and I can speak very personally about this as a contractor. I need to be able to build this on site, so I need to be able to build something that's going to be feasible, and the best net gain designs that I see are the ones that have truly fantastic ecology thinking behind them, and I can trust them and I know that they're going to work. You know, as a contractor, we want that's in our best interest, and it delivers the best outcomes on site. If you get something that's just been kind of made up with the numbers to get there, I can instantly look at it. I've had so many discussions with our landscape contractors that just like, this, it's not going to work, you know, and so we rely on that ecology design, using the numbers appropriately, but essentially it's got to be based on good ecology design.
Yeah, this is really crucial, and we're going to come back to this when we start talking about the process through which the development process and what biodiversity net gain means at each of the stages within that process. But what we've tried to do so far is give you an overview of what biodiversity net gain is, what the national legislation and policy is both saying at the moment and will be saying shortly. And what we want to move on to is now to talk about, well, what does this actually mean within Greater Manchester? So I'm going to pass back to Sam to give us an overview of where we are within Greater Manchester in relation to biodiversity net gain. Sam.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so I think the first place I wanted to start was on our 5-year environment plan, which we published at the Mayor's Second Green Summit nearly 2 years ago now, March 2019. And that sets out our environmental ambitions across the board, particularly in terms of our ambitions to be carbon neutral city region by 2038, but also for our natural environment and our ambitions for there to be a green city region for everyone. Particularly on the natural environment, we set the ambition to protect, maintain and enhance our natural environment and take steps to achieve environmental net gain, so wider net gain in our environmental assets. And biodiversity net gain is a key commitment within that plan to ensure that we are ready and prepared for the changes at a national level that Nick outlined earlier on. So it really sits as a core part of our ambitions for our natural environment, alongside trying to increase investment in our natural environment, of which we will hear later on how this provides a key mechanism to do that, and engaging more people with our natural environment. So if you just go to the next slide, please, Tom. Within that plan, and with the work we're doing at Greater Manchester, we are developing our strategic planning, and all our local planning authorities have to have a local plan in place by December 2023. As many of you will be aware, we've been working for several years on a spatial strategy for Greater Manchester. We had a draft of that in October last year, which included specific policies on protection and enhancement of Greater Manchester's green network and urban green space. And within those commitments, this included, once it's adopted, achieving a measurable net gain in biodiversity of no less than 10%. So bringing in that national requirement through our spatial strategy. And those policies, that policy on biodiversity net gain and the wider policies on green infrastructure and things like a green factor ratio for new developments were strongly supported through that process. Since October, Stockport withdrew from the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework, and on Friday this week, the remaining 9 authorities will be discussing proposals to continue to progress a plan for the remaining 9 districts called Places for Everyone. And the key driver for that really is to keep within it, and within those 9 districts, these strategic priorities and policies, so that we don't lose the very strongly supported policies that were in that draft of October 2020. So there should be more following a meeting of the Executive Board of the Association of Greater Manchester Authorities on Friday this week. Next slide, please, Tom. So just a bit more on what the that draft from October's Greater Manchester Spatial Framework said. I won't go through all of these, but the plan had the ambition for a net enhancement of biodiversity and geodiversity across the plan as a whole, through things like increasing the quality, quantity, extent and diversity of habitats, improving connections between those habitats, and enhancing the management of existing habitats. So it contained a series of more detailed commitments to support that ambition and policy of a 10% biodiversity net gain through that plan once it's adopted. So that's just a bit of a flavour for the priority that we're giving to biodiversity net gain within Greater Manchester, within our 5-year environment plan, and within the successor to the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework. So I'll now hand back to Tom.
Thank you so much, Sam. That's fantastic, and gives us a helpful overview. Before I move on to the next part, which is having a look at these different stages, I want to flag thank you so much for everybody putting questions in the question box. Please continue to do so. It's great that Nick is doing a fantastic job answering those. We will make sure that rather than you having to try and read all of those and listen to what we're saying at the same time, we'll make sure that we'll circulate the slides following this, but also we'll see how we can circulate some of the questions and answers anonymously, of course, in terms of the questions following this as well, because I think there's some lots of good stuff going on there. But what we're going to do next in our presentation is talk about how biodiversity net gain shapes and changes what we might do through a development process. And we'll talk later about how this could play out for local authorities specifically. But if developers are looking at this and thinking, how does this shift what we're doing? I think it's really important to have a think about these different stages. And Julia and I are going to run through these and talk through these in a little bit of detail. One of the things, before we get into that detail, one of the things I want to flag is that from an ecologist point of view, sitting in a consultancy, biodiversity net gain extends the windows where we engage in the development process. And it extends it in two directions. It extends it in time. And so we would want to get involved much earlier, feasibility and scoping right up the front, ideally even before land is bought, and that's really a cost saving for the developer if we can understand the implications for biodiversity before you even buy a piece of land. And then it extends it in the other direction as well into the monitoring and maintenance of the site. As Nick said, the Environment Bill will bring in requirements for that to be managed and looked after for 30 years, which is very significant. The other way it expands what we do. So if that's the first one, expanding in time, the second is that actually biodiversity net gain takes into account all of those habitats on site, barring the irreplaceable habitats, as we said earlier, but all of the habitats, and not just those that we're identifying specifically for an ecological function, but the whole lot. And because of that, that joined up work in the design process with the landscape architects and others is really crucial. And so those two pieces, from my point of view, are going to be something that play out again and again in how we develop and design net gain. But let's get into the detail. Julia, did you want to say something from a construction point of view, from an sort of an overview for this first before we get into the detail?
Yeah, absolutely. A shout out for us as contractors. Just please involve us early. You know, I work closely with a lot of very brilliant design teams, and we can bring that buildability assessment with us, and it's especially important with biodiversity net gain. You know, we might know that particular machinery or how we might run a construction site in ways to retain those habitat types. You know, we might be able to come up with those engineering ideas that you know, ideally for you really want that as part of your thinking, part of that assessment. So I think what I really take about biodiversity net gain is that it involves so many different people. It's definitely not in the hands of the ecologists. And the true projects that I've seen the most successful, and the most successful being time, cost, and biodiversity outcomes, is when everyone's on the same page at the start.
Very good. So let's get into some of this detail. I'm very tempted to get involved in the discussions in the chat. I'll ignore them for the moment in the questions and answers, and we'll come back to those. Some lovely, lovely points and questions coming up. Feasibility and scoping is really crucial for biodiversity net gain. And also, net gain provides us a really lovely opportunity because we can start to understand the implications of developing on a site before we even visit it. This provides a massive shift in the amount of information we can provide to the developer in order to make an informed decision about what's possible on that site, and where the key habitats are to avoid or to enhance. So this is a really important opportunity. And what we've got listed here is some of the key steps or key pieces that we would expect to think about through that feasibility stage. Now, for a very small development, this point, identifying stakeholders, could sound terrifying. That could just be the local authority. That could just be picking up the phone to local authority to understand what their requirements are, understand what is being needed for biodiversity net gain. And within Greater Manchester, all of these will be fleshed out in some guidance that's be coming out shortly, that will set out exactly what we'd be looking for within each of these pieces. So engaging stakeholders can be really valuable. It can also be really valuable for a larger development if you are perhaps wanting to make sure that a relevant NGO locally is on board with what we're planning for an area, or even potentially able to help deliver some of it. And I know, Julia, you've had examples of exactly that type of project, haven't you, with some of the larger projects you work on?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's those, the early discussion pieces when biodiversity net gain is the thinking right from the start of the project. It just makes it just so much more deliverable. You're saving time and cost. The later that you leave it, it's harder to retrofit it, kind of work it into a project, and it's just more time and costly and probably less successful and more difficult at the end of the day. So bringing it right on board pretty early with feasibility and scoping. And certainly for our larger projects, we have definitely gone out and just had very, very early discussions with stakeholders saying, look, we are really, really early. We don't have all the answers. We don't have, any sense of the design, but we're looking to net gain, and we want to do something meaningful. The thing about that is you get a lot of information really early on that's incredibly useful. You get to learn what people are worried about, so you can build that in terms of your design. You get to learn what the opportunities are. And typically for us in construction, we're probably working all over the place, and I've never really worked, very rarely worked very, very locally. So to tap into those discussions, if people are open to talk to us, but for our side as well, to be very transparent in what we're trying to do, can just make sense down the line as well.
And a nice example of this is that we're working with a house builder and looking at retrospectively looking at a whole load of developments and seeing whether they would have delivered biodiversity net gain under their existing layouts and so on. And we found that most of them, or about 50% of them, wouldn't deliver net gain under their existing layouts. And this comes back to the point Julia made right at the start. This isn't just business as normal. Some of them, another proportion of them, could have delivered net gain by enhancing what they were doing on site a little bit. But this was quite challenging, looking at this and thinking, actually, our schemes at the moment aren't delivering this. Well, what do we need to do to make sure that's, and what are the costs going to be? We then looked at some schemes where the layouts weren't defined, and we were going right into this very early stage where we were thinking, right, we've got this piece of land, what is this going to look like? And we worked through with a group of the developers team and the local ecologists and so on to work through, well, what does this actually mean for this site? And interestingly, every one of those workshops we looked at a specific site, we found that in those cases, they were able to deliver net gain on site without decreasing the development footprint, but by making sure that they were avoiding key habitats that were on site, that they and enhancing them where possible. Now, that's not going to be the case in every scenario, but that shift from the majority of them being actually deliverable on site, especially when you're impacting on some arable fields rather than anything nicer, is really comes to play when you get involved really early. One of the other things that's set out here is set a goal. Now, the Environment Bill will do that for us. It'll set a target of 10% net gain. We won't have that in legislation, as Nick has said, until 2023 as a legal requirement. In the interim, within Manchester, we are looking at a 10% requirement, so in line with what the Environment Bill is setting out, and we're looking to move that forward so that we can be clear and transparent about what's being delivered here. This is really important because that gives us that point to head to and gives us that clarity on what's possible. So let's move on to impact assessment, because I think this is a really important point that a lot of our time. So if feasibility and scoping is something that maybe some of us in consultancy don't necessarily get drawn into on a day-to-day basis, and something that we perhaps now there's a real opportunity to do so, our bread and butter is looking at impact assessment. This is something we do day in, day out, whether it be environmental impact assessment or ecological impact assessment, or simply a preliminary ecological assessment to make sure that we're not having impacts and don't need to do further work. Getting this right for biodiversity net gain is crucial. And one of the key things here is making sure that we get that information on the baseline absolutely right. And you'll see this in a lot of the biodiversity net gain work, is that this is not a brand new thing. We don't need to go out and do brand new different surveys from those that we might do for ecological impact assessment or a preliminary ecological assessment. What we do need to do is we need to add to that. So when we're out on site, we also need to check the condition, monitor or survey the condition of those sites and get a really good understanding of what habitats are there. That will help us apply the mitigation hierarchy. That will help us inform the assessment that we need to do. Julia, on impact assessment, anything you'd like to add? Otherwise, we'll move on to the design piece, which is where I spend a lot of my time.
Yeah, I think in a very, very practical sense, the first thing that we need to get is what Tom alluded to, the project baseline. In very practical terms, that's a map of your habitats. It all starts off with that habitat map. We talked about biodiversity net gain is essentially such a habitat focus. So it is about getting that habitat right. And for larger projects with more resources, it's really exciting looking at the digital technologies that are coming on board, because when you have that habitat map and when you know the areas that are to be excluded and avoided as much as possible, we can really embed that in our BIM models, in our engineering models as well. But even with the very small developments that I work with, working closely with the architect and then the landscape architect, everything about construction is so visual and so map focused. The most practical starting point, if you're on biodiversity net gain, is to get a really, as best as possible, a habitat map, and then that starts the conversation.
Then we get into a lovely part of design, and this is really, really exciting from a ecologist point of view, because we can sit with the landscape architects, with the people designing that place, and contribute in a way that's actually going to both build biodiversity net gain into the design, but also join that up with other ambitions, whether that be access to green space, providing flood relief, improving air quality, and so on, by developing a design that's going to bring together all of those pieces. That, for me, is really exciting and something that biodiversity net gain really brings to the table, because every piece of that, whether it's a football field or a beautiful meadow, all is part of the picture within biodiversity net gain. All counts and contributes towards our assessment. So designing that, designing for net gain is really, really crucial. And as I've said, a different housing developer, but a lovely example, I think it was in Manchester again, where The design was done without thinking about biodiversity net gain. They found it was a loss. If they went back and looked at it and decided that actually, if they had thought about it at the point of design, they could have shifted the design to put the green space into a different place, maintain the woodland that was already there, create a nice piece of green space around that, improve their sustainable urban drainage so that it was actually providing some ecological function as well as the flood risk management that was needed. And they would be able to deliver net gain on site. So again, this is a really crucial piece, and this join up between the landscape architects, the design team, and the ecologists is something that we're going to see more and more and more, and can only be a good thing for all of us, for biodiversity, for the local people, but also for the design of these places.
And it's tricky now, right, Tom? I mean, you and I have so
Yeah,
many conversations that you talk to a developer and you explain this, and then you get shuffled down the way because you're kind of in that ecology box, and you're the last person maybe to come to a site. So by all means, Tom and I are absolutely working on the projects where you don't get involved early, and then you're the one to say to them, well, actually, we can't deliver this on site because of this, and this. And it's there are projects out there that are hard, and just to I guess my experience has been is the harder the conversation, actually what I find with my clients and my developers is that even if it's a really hard conversation, so long as I explain it and so long as I put the solution out there, I found that there's a kind of an appreciation for what they need to do next time around. I had this conversation that was actually getting nowhere and really difficult, and I could tell the developer understandably was getting more and more frustrated, and I thought, gosh, okay, I've got to stop this now. And he looked at me and he said, look, Julia, I haven't enjoyed this at all, but I'm really, really glad that you took the time to explain it to me because I understand it now and I won't be doing this again. So it reflects where we are, the here and now. We are going to work towards that place when we are truly ecologists and contractors. We're truly involved really early on in a genuine thinking about biodiversity net gain. And the best thing that we could do now is start talking about that, because then we create a momentum to get there. And the other thing just to point out about that is not a numbers game, but the metric helps. It really does help the communication piece, the raising awareness, running different metrics on different option scenarios. I've had so many of those kind of small to medium developers when slight tweaks, like Tom was saying, can really make a difference. And showing that within the metric, and I love a graph, so I normally produce quite a few, just helps that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. That's measuring of predicted gains can be hugely valuable, and this is really important then for thinking, well, do we need something off-site? Do we need something outside the development red line boundary in order to deliver the gains that are needed? Remember, biodiversity net gain will become a requirement for the planning application, so we need to see that delivery. Now, how do we do that? Can we do it on site, or actually is this something that we're going to need to do nearby elsewhere? And this is an iterative process. This is what's meant by and round again. We need to think about this design process as iterative. So we might come up with initial design, and then we have to tweak and shift and shape that. Now that happens anyway when we're thinking about, I don't know, the design of where the road goes or whatever it might be. That's also needing to be part of the picture for the ecology and for the landscape as well now, or even more so perhaps, because by tweaking and shifting that, we can make sure that what we're putting in place is both deliverable and delivering as much biodiversity as we can get on site, and also understanding what needs to be done elsewhere. We're going to come back to the point about the elsewhere and what might be being developed within Greater Manchester towards the end of this presentation with Derek. But before we do, we've got a few other pieces, and this isn't the end of the process. So this, for many of us as consultants, we might have then handed something in at local with the planning application, and then think that's great, we'll pass that on, and that's done. Tick, good. For the developer, it may well be that they then go through further stages, obviously of construction, but we also need to think about monitoring and maintenance. And construction is crucial because there are real opportunities here, aren't there, Julia?
Yeah, thanks, Tom, for flagging my construction world. So firstly, just to say, I really need a great handover from Tom. You know, if this is now going to be in my hands, sometimes I'm involved in the design process, sometimes we're not. It depends on the project and the particular contract. But even if I am involved or I'm not involved, the handover, making sure that I have the full metric, you know, the raw data behind it, maybe there's some GIS layers, to really embed this as part of a construction. So typically there would need to be an update for a biodiversity baseline. On some of our large projects, there might be quite a long time lead in. So I need to factor that in. And even on some of the smaller projects as well, we just need to double check and sense check that biodiversity baseline. But just like, you know, we all have construction documents, there might be a construction environment management plan or whatever that might be. It's being clear that this is a change. You know, normally ecology is something to do, and then we get to do the and I'm not saying this is what I think, but it's normally the ecology isn't a deliverable in itself. You know, normally it's just part of the works, but the actual deliverable is that new housing development or that new road or that new railway. But this is the change, right? You know, biodiversity net gain is an actual outcome from the development, and having that actually embedded right from the start in construction. And the best thing that we can do is to really avoid or reduce that time lag between the losses and the gains, because we'll make better gains and we'll see better results than we do that. Practically, I have to be very careful with that. You know, we can't suddenly plant and then the construction team don't have any space. But there's certainly opportunities to look into that, and working very closely with our supply chains or with the landscape contractors, we can really identify those opportunities that aren't apparent in the design. You know, when you're physically on site building it, you just see and can act on new opportunities that come up. But it's also it's so great for us. You know, I find the construction teams genuinely engaged with the net gain concept. You know, everyone knows about the biodiversity crisis. I think particularly COVID-19 has really brought home the importance of being next to nature. So it's a very different conversation on site now. And again, I'm going to just highlight the metric and the use of numbers and graphs as a kind of communication tool. You know, the more that we can engage people with this, the better results that we can get. And it's not in the hands of the ecologists. You know, everyone has to be engaged with this, and everyone has to really buy into that concept of, well, look, we're creating something here. It's not something to do to get out of the way. We're creating that. And the best thing that I can do is work on a collaborative basis with the construction team.
Yeah, this is a really important role, and you're absolutely right. This is a collaborative piece of work. The ecological clerk of works could have a really key role within that, in that collaborative approach to actually getting the best outcomes on site. Then we, as I said right at the outset, this is extending as well beyond, say, a 3 or 5 year management plan into a long-term management plan that's going to set out what we need to be doing for 30 years, so that we're looking for 30 years worth of management and monitoring to make sure that these habitats are delivered. And 30 years might seem like a very long time, and it's a big shift from where we are at the moment. For some of those habitats, they perhaps still won't be fully mature in that time frame. So what do we need to do to make sure that happens? Well, we need to make sure that we're putting that management into the hands of somebody or an organization that's able to deliver that. That's crucial, that they have the skills and the expertise to do that. And I'm really glad to say that there are lots of organizations out there that do have that skill and expertise, whether it be management companies that are looking after part of a housing development, or organizations like the Wildlife Trusts or the RSPB National Trust, or water companies that have some really good experience of delivering high quality habitats on their sites. And what we need to do is build into that approach, setting out clearly within a long-term management plan. We need to set out the monitoring requirements as well, that then feeds back to the local authorities, feeds back to the ecology unit, so that we can make sure that that delivery is happening at the right pace, in the right way. And if it's not, we've got early warnings of that, and we can adapt what we're doing to take into account changes that we might need to make.
My advice is to have that discussion as early as possible. It is a change. And we were talking with the team yesterday about it, like, okay, our aftercare is normally 5 years. Julia, what do you mean 30 years? You know, this is a transition for industry, and it is a change, and to have those conversations early and try and come up with those practical solutions. They are definitely practical solutions out there. Again, we're working on a stage when there's no kind of ready market, or, you know, whatever that might be. But I've certainly worked with colleagues who have found ways, you know, and really great ways to make this happen with good biodiversity outcomes. But, you know, the handover to the maintainer or the handover to a landowner, whatever that might be, just works. And you need to give yourself time for that to find those solutions. So if you can have those conversations early, the better outcomes you'll get.
And just to be really clear here, I don't think we're talking necessarily about long-term management plans for a football field or for a piece of grassland like that. Once that's in place and being looked after, I don't think we're going to need an ecologist to go out and check that it's still a football field in 30 years' time. What we really need to focus on is those good quality habitats, the higher end of the ecological value habitats, like the priority habitats and similar, to make sure that we are delivering those appropriately. But yeah, so there's a lot of opportunities there, but it's really important that we recognise that that long-term ambition is set out and clearly owned by somebody, so the responsibility is transparent.
Yeah, and you know, we will, you know, we typically come in, build something, and then we go. But I can help my client. You know, I can help my client have those discussions, find whatever, you know, that might be the maintainer. So we have early discussions with them. We're just running the first year of an aftercare program, and we're already engaging, working with the maintainer who's going to take it on afterwards. And they've come out on site, and you know, they're going to be with us as part of that journey. So the handover, they know it, they understand it. On other sites, you know, we've been looking at biodiversity offsets as early as possible, thinking about the end of use and how that's going to go. So even though we won't be doing it, we certainly have a part to play in looking for those solutions and finding those practical ways forward.
So we've just had a canter through, and it really has been, from my point of view anyway, a canter through some of the key pieces of work that need to be done through a development process to deliver biodiversity net gain. From the very early assessment of the site through to the design, the construction, and then into looking after that site over the longer term, especially those high quality habitats. Now, at a planning application, this is going to shift a little bit what's required. And we're likely to see, and certainly within Greater Manchester, we will need a GIS layer, so that's Geographic Information System, a layer, a mapped layer, pre and post development. So what's there in the baseline and what's planned to be there, what's going to be there over the long term as you create those habitats. Now, those layers, for most of us working in consultancies, no, we produce those layers already. We don't always provide them. Well, it's about time we did, isn't it? It's about time we actually sent those through both to the developer, but also then on to the local authority so that they can keep track of what's happening where. That needs to be accompanied by reports. That's perhaps nothing new. A copy of the metric is going to be part of that requirement. And then we've already talked about this long-term management plan, this 30-year management plan. Now, there's a star against that because that long-term management plan may not be provided by the developer. It depends who is delivering the habitats on the site that's needed to deliver the net gain. It may be that it's a third party delivering that site, whether it be a wildlife trust or another organization. And in that case, they would be able to provide that long-term management plan and sign up to that. Now, the other part in brackets here is this net gain plan. And the reason it's got 2023 in there is that that's what's coming through with the Environment Bill, that we will need to deliver and provide net gain plans with our planning applications. But we don't know what those look like yet. I'm sure we can quiz Nick on that, but I think the answer, I guess, will be wait and see. Let's keep some of the surprises, but that will be developed over the next couple of years, and we'll start to see what that looks like. But at the moment, we need these GIS layers, the report, the metric, and that long-term management plan. That's where we're heading. This will all be set out and is set out in the guidance that will be issued for Greater Manchester. So some clarity around all of those requirements will be set out there. Now, that is a canter through. And for those of you who are in local authorities within Greater Manchester, we have got training coming up that goes into a lot more detail on all of this over the next few weeks. So if you haven't signed up already, please do. But what we want to move on to is to flag how this work relates or links in with some of the other work that's going on in Greater Manchester. We're not going to be able to do all of that in the time, but we do want to point to one or two things. And this is where I'm going to pass back to Sam, and it'll give me a chance to have a look at the questions as well. Pass back to Sam to say something about the nature recovery and the green infrastructure work in Greater Manchester. Sam.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so just a bit more.
Sorry, Sam, I realised I've got one more slide here. I was just going to say something very quickly. My apologies.
Go for it.
And all this slide is flagging is that this is also part of the principles for biodiversity net gain. So I should have made that really clear. This bringing together these benefits so that we get the carbon storage, the flood management, recreational space, and the biodiversity net gain all together is really, really important. Now, whether that site that we're looking at in that picture could actually deliver the recreational space that we need is an important question. Maybe that picture is not the right one to use in that case, but bringing those together wherever we can is really crucial. So it's in the principles already, which is great, but it's also in what we're doing in Greater Manchester. Sorry, Sam, now over to you.
Quite all right, thanks, Tom. Yeah, so I guess building on that and that approach of maximising those other benefits as well. We have been selected as one of 5 pilot areas by DEFRA and Natural England to pilot what's called local nature recovery strategies, and these are another element of the government's environment bill, another part of that puzzle in the environment bill through which the government's trying to achieve that step change in nature's recovery. So we've been selected as one of 5 pilot areas to develop these strategies, and they will become mandatory once the environment bill becomes the Environment Act, and each local authority or combined authority across England will need to develop one of these strategies. These strategies have the aim of setting out a place's priorities for nature's recovery. So what are its key priorities for biodiversity across its area, and setting those out in one place with the aim of driving action, not just within local authorities and combined authorities, but across all landowners, individuals, organisations within an area, and bringing all of that together into one place. Quite excitingly as well, they will also provide a key way of prioritising investment in an area, and particularly for biodiversity net gain, they will help identify the most important and strategic locations for delivery of off-site biodiversity net gain. Through this strategy and this pilot process, we are, and you can see one of our early maps on the right hand side, which is mapping the current places and spaces that are good for nature in Greater Manchester. We are bringing in not only what is good for biodiversity and nature, but also where those can overlap with other key environmental benefits. So thinking about, particularly as an example, the lowland peatland in Chat Moss, where we can deliver new habitats, but we can also deliver significant carbon sequestration benefits. Likewise, in the upland areas, the orange areas around the fringes of Greater Manchester, we can improve habitats there, but at the same time, we can also sequester carbon, and we can introduce natural flood management processes as well. So that work is really bringing together where can be prioritised for action for nature, but also understanding where multiple benefits can be delivered, not just for nature, but for some of those examples like carbon sequestration and natural flood management. So we're developing that plan at the moment. Some of you on this call today may have been involved in workshops that we've been delivering over the past month to help us go through and understand where our priorities are and should be. And we'll be looking to publish a draft plan later in the spring, which will help inform, particularly for us today, where off-site biodiversity net gain could have the greatest strategic impact across Greater Manchester. So that's kind of the strategy and planning work that we're carrying out. On the next slide, Tom, is a bit about the work we are doing in terms of maximising the opportunities we see from investment in habitats that biodiversity net gain will bring. And I think there's been a couple of questions on this in the chat. So I won't go through all the detail in the diagram here, but we over the last 12 months have been working with Lancashire Wildlife Trust, who on our behalf are setting up a Greater Manchester Environment Fund with the aim of bringing more investment and more diverse sources of investment into our natural environment in Greater Manchester. And through a successful application to the government's Green Recovery Challenge Fund, have already brought in nearly £2 million of funding to go into key parts of our nature recovery network that we saw on the previous slide, for example, in the lowland wetland areas in Salford and Wigan, and in the upland areas such as Dovestones in Oldham. So we're already bringing in, through this approach, greater funding into our natural environment in Greater Manchester. We also see opportunities to bring in not grant funding like that, not public funding, but private investment. And given what we've heard today about the introduction of mandatory biodiversity net gain, we believe that will provide a big opportunity within Greater Manchester to attract other sources of investment into habitat creation. So through the GM Environment Fund and working with financial advisors, we've been able to bring in through the Natural Course project. We are piloting this approach within Greater Manchester and looking at how we can get to a model whereby we can secure funding for the upfront delivery of habitat creation through a habitat bank facility and deliver that in advance of need. So this is very much sort of cutting edge of work in this area, still very much under development, but with the ambition of providing a mechanism within Greater Manchester, within the Environment Fund we are setting up, to deliver investment in our habitats in advance of those being needed, so that when development takes place in Greater Manchester, we have a ready-made, supported set of habitats ready to be able to benefit from those credits. So very much work in progress, and really at kind of the cutting edge of getting other sources of finance and investment into the natural environment, which is a nut that we and the national government and others are trying to crack. So that's just a bit of an overview of two areas of focus, both on the strategy and policy side and on the investment side, that we are working to develop within Greater Manchester. So with that, I think it's back over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Sam. That's really helpful, and what an exciting opportunity, because that's going to open up both the opportunities for some real integrated solutions, but also hopefully make the development process much smoother, where we've got a clear process for delivering offsets if needed. We're going to touch, and I am aware of the time, we're going to touch on the role of the local authorities and how that's shifting and growing, and it is something that's in transition at the moment. And then I'm going to pass over to Derek to talk about the ecology unit. So that's where we are in our presentation. Then we'll come to questions and try and get to some of the questions that have been coming through. The role of the planning authority in all of this is very much still emerging and developing, and within the 10 local authorities within the Greater Manchester area, we have got a range of authorities at different places through this. But the ambition is to update and improve the local plan policies and support those with supplementary planning documents. And I know that there are some draft supplementary planning documents that are being looked at the moment in relation to biodiversity net gain. And the point of those will be to support the development and developers coming forward, so that there's clarity on requirement of what's needed for biodiversity net gain. There's also opportunities to look at strategic land allocation, and this has been done elsewhere in the UK, where strategic land allocation has been identified. The biodiversity requirement, because we can run the assessment early, the biodiversity requirement has been undertaken, and you can then link that directly to a potential compensation site, one of these habitat banks, one of these sites where we've got some habitat being created already to provide some enhancement. And that, again, will open up and help the flow of development. There's also opportunities for providing advice to on biodiversity net gain for to developers, and I'm going to let Derek say more about that in a moment, but that's something that we can certainly need to think about and explore. And we can also add to this some clarity on what would be required within Section 106 agreements. And again, some standardized text is starting to evolve both within Greater Manchester, but also drawing on what's been developed elsewhere, like in Warwickshire and elsewhere, on what good practice looks like. And again, this is all being developed with the aim of smoothing that process so that when we come to the point where we need that agreement for the delivery of the net gain, that it's really clear and set out in a straightforward manner. We've already just talked about potential sites for providing net gain outside the development parcel, so I'm not going to go into that again. But again, that's something that will be developed, and you can see here this oversight opportunity or responsibility that the local authorities and the ecology unit will be having around the delivery of this biodiversity net gain is going to be crucial. So there's a whole range of shifts and changes to how some of the local authorities will be working. That's in development. We've got a bit of time before the Environment Bill becomes an act, but that's something that's being developed and explored at the moment with 4 local authorities with biodiversity net gain in their local plan, some, as I say, some SPDs in draft, and so on. So very much work in progress, something that's being developed and something that I'm sure you'll see more of over the next little while, but all to be supported by the guidance that's coming out shortly after this presentation. Very good. So I'm going to pass to Derek there. So that's a very high level of the types of changes that we're seeing at local authority level. Derek's going to give us a much more detailed or a much more nuanced view from the ecology unit. Derek, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. Yes, GMEU, the Greater Manchester Ecology Unit, we're a specialist shared service, a team of ecologists, and we provide ecology and nature conservation advice to the 10 councils of Greater Manchester primarily, but we also provide advice to other local planning authorities, Warrington, some districts in Lancashire. What that means is we have a very big geography that we're working with. So lots of different habitat types, lots of different landscapes, from uplands to city centres, to lowland wetlands. We have some coastline that we're working with in Lancashire. So we have a very big geography, very wide landscape. We have a wide range of planning applications we look at, from single householder applications in deep urban landscapes to very big, very large applications, sometimes multiple district applications as well. So we've got a wide range of the types of application that we look at. We're also working with quite a wide range of different local authorities, so we can get a perspective as to what differences there are in the approaches being taken within those different local authorities in different places, which is quite interesting in itself. GMEU, we have another couple of advantages in that we also act as the local biological records centre for Greater Manchester. That means we have the habitat and species databases for Greater Manchester, which really helps when we're looking at the impact of applications, when we're assessing metrics that have been submitted as part of applications, and when we're looking at the best places to deliver habitats and the best types of habitat to deliver. And we can also bring in species into that mix as well as the habitats through our species databases. So that biological records centre role is important as well, and will become more important, I think, as we get involved in monitoring and reporting back on the success of net gain. Another point, GMEU, we also act as what's called a habitat delivery partner for Natural England for a Great Crested Newt district level licensing scheme. That involves digging ponds on sites which are best for newts, not necessarily best for the development. And what that gives us an insight to, actually on quite a small scale, but it's an interesting insight into the resource it takes and what it takes to deliver habitats off-site in the best places. You know, how do we negotiate with landowners? How much does it cost? You know, all those practicalities. Next slide, please, Tom. Okay, just some detail as to what we get involved with in the development management role, part of our service delivery. We are seeking net gain wherever we can, across all types of planning applications at the moment. We are not looking at metric calculations across all applications. There is obviously a resource implication for that, in terms of the consultants and developers learning how to use the metric and getting used to it and submitting it. We encourage the application of the metric on certain applications, planning applications, which lend themselves better, I think, the larger applications, which it's more productive to apply the metric there, but it's not yet a requirement for all applications that they use the metric. We rely on the NPPF guidance and local plan policies there. We're not yet at the position where the Environment Bill has become law that we can require it in all cases. We are helping applicants and consultants to use the metric. It's new, we're all learning. So we're helping authorities and applicants and consultants to use and apply the metric. We also check and interpret metrics. And I think it's been said previously, both by Tom and by Julia, that it's important that the metric is a really good starting point, if you like, but it is just one part of a process, and we build on the metric and have you know, those discussions and negotiations about how and what will be delivered as part of net gain. Part of that is advising on on-site and off-site provision, on what habitats where. We're also involved in pricing up net gain. What if it needs to be off-site, if a financial contribution is to be made, what is the level of that financial contribution? And that is very variable. It depends on the habitat type, it depends on the location, it depends on many different factors. So that's a big part of the process as well. And then we're getting involved increasingly in advising on the application and discharge of conditions for net gain, or the drawing up of S106 agreements, unilateral undertakings for net gain. You will appreciate from all of that that is quite a lot of additional work to look at when you're looking at a planning application. We feel that the involvement of specialists, not just ecologists actually, but land managers, land agents, lawyers, the involvement of all those specialisms in the process does add to the resources needed that will deliver net gain. And it's something we're looking at the moment, and we're in our pilot work. What we're doing is working out, well, how much resource does this actually take to do? What I would say as part of that resource issue is, yes, it takes additional resources, but we've been doing this for about 18 months now in earnest, trying to deliver net gain, and it really does make a difference. If you look at what we would have achieved through, you might call the more conventional approaches dealing with planning applications, compared to applying the metric and seeking a percentage of net gain in quantitative terms, that is really is making a big difference to what we can get done. So the resource, yes, it takes resource, but the resource is really making a difference. Tom, I think there's one more slide for me. Tom, was there one slide left for me, Tom?
We may have lost Tom. Derek, do you want to just, I'll try and bring it up if you want to just carry on.
Sorry,
Okay.
Derek, I am here. I was just trying to reshare because I was told in the chat that it was showing the wrong thing. So I'm just pulling that up now. So hopefully if I do this and then press this button, is this the right slide?
Yeah, just briefly, just the future roles, what we may be involved in the future. That somebody's going to have to maintain the register of biodiversity net gain sites. Somebody's going to advise on the suitability of habitat banks, advising on and preparing long-term management plans, net gain plans, and also monitoring the effectiveness of net gain. That is something that all these things, we're not quite there yet with doing these things, but it is a role, I think, for local authority ecologists and others, particularly in the monitoring role. So there's important future resources to think about when we're working to apply net gain across a wider range of applications. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you so much, Derek. That was really helpful, and sorry for the slight mix up with the slides there. Yeah, really helpful to get that overview. Now, the key message, I guess, is that biodiversity net gain is coming. We've got a whole load of resources within Greater Manchester that are available. We've obviously got the CIEM good practice principles and CIEM Syria and IEMA good practice principles and guidance, but alongside that and supporting that and going into the detail within Greater Manchester, we're going to make this recording available to you along with the slides. And we'll also have the guidance document I've mentioned a couple of times already coming out to you as well. We'll provide a link to some of this information after the webinar. So biodiversity net gain is coming. It's on its way, and part of what we wanted to do today is flag that and give everybody the opportunity to have some time to think about what this could mean for you. We've got quite a lot of questions and comments, and I would love opportunity to go through a few of those. We do have a few minutes. Julia, I don't know whether there's any you have seen that you'd particularly like to pick out and either ask one of the speakers to answer or to provide a comment on.
I thought there was a couple of interesting ones in terms of, and one that I'm certainly interested, how is this link measured to well-being and health? As there's a way to prove outputs. If you can't measure it, you can't prove it. Is there one metrics? And I'm working on a scoping study looking at the connections and should there be connections and how would we do that between biodiversity net gain and well-being. And a kind of a sneaky shout out, we'll be publishing the results of that towards the end of this month, early March. What we're keen to do is actually look at what are the existing requirements. There is certainly a link between creating more and better habitats and people's health and well-being, and we've seen that even more so under COVID-19, but it's working out what are the existing requirements in policy for health and well-being, for biodiversity net gain, and delivering both in very, very complementary ways. So it's a great question. There are definitely links, but I think there's a thinking and a join up piece there that we started on the other project. So kind of watch that space for now.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. That's a really good and a really interesting piece of work. I'm really interested. I would love to get into a discussion, Tanya and Dick and others, about bat boxes, bird boxes, etc., and whether they're habitats or not. I'm not going to bore those of us that are not ecologists in the detail of that. I think the key point there is that those aren't within the metric, so they're not counted within the metric. And my understanding is that that is going to be the case for metric 3 as well as it is now.
But just to emphasize the point, because I have a lot of discussion with ecologists, they're saying, well, if they're not counted in the metric, no one's going to want to pay for them, or if they're not counted in the metric, you know, what can we do with them? And you've got to think about when you're creating habitats, it probably won't be up and ready for wildlife as a nesting resource, as a bat roosting resource there and then. It's going to take time to get to that. And often we have a blended approach where you are blending in mitigation for the impacts on species, and part of that is your journey too. And then the extra bit is biodiversity net gain. So I think it's it's a long timeline for a woodland to truly become a woodland with those bats, rot holes and everything in trees. So as an interim measure to get there, and that is the bolts and braces of the whole approach. It's providing those immediate nest and roosting boxes as a short-term immediate measure. The developers that I speak to are definitely the ones that say, well, look, if it's not the metric, some of them, to be honest, if it's not the metric, why we should pay for it. But it's part of the my job is to get a net biodiversity net gain that is truly biodiversity net gain, but is proportionate to development, and at the end of the day we'll get them planning permission. And it's working through that and getting your developer to understand that this is just the whole picture. It's the whole picture of habitat creation and enhancement, and along the way to that there's a place for those boxes.
Yeah, absolutely support that. Duncan has asked a question about DEFRA 3.0 and the timeline for that. Nick, I don't know whether you're able to say something to that.
Yeah, it will be coming out in spring, which I appreciate isn't spectacularly precise. It should be the early part of spring, but we're just in the final stages of finishing some stuff off with it. So the spring is when we're aiming for. Alongside the main metric 3.0, at the same time, we'll also be releasing a simplified version of that for use with smaller sites. So watch out for that as well. That will be going out as a consultation version. So it's a kind of complementary metric, but it's intended for use with smaller sites.
Thank you, Nick. That's great. There are lots of other questions here that we're not going to get to today. My apologies. What we will do is we'll take these away and consider how we might draw this together into some frequently asked questions or something similar. But I just wanted to say, before I pass back to Sam to close, just to say thank you to everybody for all of your questions and for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure to have the opportunity, and I hope we can continue the conversations perhaps in person as well one day. Sam, thank you so much. I'm going to pass back to you for final words.
Thank you, Tom. And just to echo Tom's thanks, really. Thanks to all of you for making the hour and a half this afternoon and for all of your questions. Just a bit of housekeeping. We will circulate to you all a link to today's recording, and we'll be publishing the slides on the website. There'll also be some GM specific guidance that we will publish on our website once they are ready. Also, just to say thanks to all our speakers today, particularly to Nick for joining us from the national team, and also to Tom, Derek and Julia for all of their excellent thought preparation and that's gone into today. I think as Tom said, biodiversity net gain is coming. It's not something that GMCA or local authorities can tackle on their own, and we really want all of your input and this to be the start of a journey with you. So we'd really like you to stay engaged with us as we go on this journey, particularly with all the exciting developments coming through the Environment Bill and elsewhere over the next couple of years. So a big thank you from me. Have a good rest of the afternoon, and we will be in touch soon. Thank you.